Hi, everyone. We see a lot of people still coming in, but I'm Craig Young. I'm a member of the leadership team for the Encore Network, as well as a member of the leadership team for the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement. And it's my pleasure to introduce Beth Steinhorn, who I serve on the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement with. I first met Beth a little over 5 years ago at a volunteer conference and immediately identified that she was definitely a thought leader in our field. And as president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, Beth partners with organizations and their leadership to increase impact through strategic and innovative engagement. She's the author of multiple books and articles, and most recently served as co-editor of the new book, Transforming Disruption to Impact, which we'll be exploring today. Beth, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks to everyone who's joining today and for Encore Network for hosting this session. As Craig mentioned, we're going to be exploring the topic of rethinking volunteerism, transforming disruption to impact. And while we have plenty to talk about, I, along with Craig, whom I hope will weigh in as well, we also want this to be as interactive as possible. So please do share questions or additional comments in the chat, and we will make sure that we not only attend to them throughout the session as they apply, but also leave some time at the end for some good discussion, because as you'll hear, one of our goals with this topic is really to drive conversation, and that happens with all of you participating and engaging. That said, before I dive into the meat of today's topic, rethinking volunteerism, I like to start with a story. And it's a story that that was told to Craig and me by one of the contributors to the book that we're going to be sharing, Cindy Zaghi-Boilo, who is the CEO of the National MS Society. And I'm excited to see in our list that we have at least one representative, you know who you are, of the MS Society on the call today, and maybe others. So welcome, Brittany and any others. But here's how the story went. She reflected that a few years back, pre-COVID-19, a teacher friend of hers had told her a story about a grade school field day competition among her students. And the teams had formed very organically, and one team clearly had all the advantages that come with weight and with confidence. The competition was tug of war. Rather than intervening to even out the teams in a rational, athletic-based way, this friend instead gravitated to the underweight team. And she called out to them and said, "Okay, team, let's huddle." And the children quickly gathered and put their heads together, quite literally, while the teacher explained the strategy of winning tug of war. She told them, hold the rope with both hands, start with your left foot in front, and at the sound of the bell, all together, lean back and pull. Keep both feet on the ground and both hands gripping the rope. Use all your weight and lean back together. After the game was over and the lighter, less confident team had won, in true Hollywood fashion, I would say, she overheard two of the kids talking, and one of them said, "You beat us like it was nothing." And the winning team member shrugged and simply replied, "Well, next time you should try a huddle." So what does that have to do with volunteerism and the disruptions of the last couple years? To me, it embodies what distinguished some organizations from others in the last few years. Even those who may have been underweight, undersized, underfunded, they adapted and pulled together, and did so because they huddled regularly. They talked about what could they do together. And whereas others that kind of just relied on their strength of history and practices that had been in place, whatever those muscles were, didn't necessarily come out ahead despite the challenges of the recent years. And yet we know one of the big challenges of recent years was, in fact, that it was hard to huddle, right? We had to huddle in different ways. And sometimes we weren't even sure if people were playing the same games. And so, again, what does that have to do with volunteerism and the last few years of disruptions? Well, that story is in some ways similar to the dozens of stories that I, along with Craig, had the privilege of collecting over the last 18 months or so, along with 2 other colleagues, as we conceived of and then developed this book, Transforming Disruption to Impact, Rethinking Volunteer Engagement for a Rapidly Changing World, along with Doug Bolton and
And
Jerome
Doug has joined
Cindy.
us today.
Oh, Doug is here. Great. Welcome, Doug. And same thing, feel free to weigh in and add your commentary throughout as well. The 4 of us, Doug, Craig, and Jerome and I, really were not seeking to create the definitive collection of, we weren't creating a guidebook or a playbook on how to transform disruption to impact by leveraging volunteers, but rather to, I think of it as sort of having our dream dinner party. Whom would we invite around the table to share, which thought leaders would we invite to share their stories and their strategies that helped them continue to deliver on mission despite the challenges that we all experienced, in some ways in similar ways and in others in different ways. Stories we collected from CEOs like Cindy of the National MS Society, along with Lauren Spiro, her VP, as well as funders, practitioners, corporate engagement consultants, and others, including Encore Network's close colleague Phyllis Siegel as well. Our goal was to offer a collection of proven pathways to impact so that organizations can break the trail of their own journey from disruption to impact, because we all face disruption, and we know that disruptions can be challenging for organizational leaders, for volunteers, and for the communities being served. Those interruptions and limitations were naturally very disheartening, disturbing, disconcerting, but disruption isn't inherently bad. Disruption can be the impetus to release ourselves from the tyranny of the way we've always done things. So if we view it as an opportunity, disruption can invite us to revisit, to rethink, and to reinvent the ways that we achieve our mission. It may even prompt us to retire practices that no longer serve us. And those are really the overarching themes, or those were some common threads across all the stories that we collected. What I want to do today in our time together is to share first a little bit about the landscape of disruption. We may have assumptions about what some of the biggest disruptions were. So I want to share some of the disruptions that we lay out and all experienced, though there may be others that you experienced as well. And then we're going to dive into what were some of the common themes, the strategies around engaging volunteers in service, and delivering on mission that were innovated or reinvigorated, and that drove success amid all of these disruptions. And we'll wrap up by also looking at new ways to think about impact. So let's start with this landscape of disruption. The landscapes of disruptions, or the types of disruptions, were really quite varied and widespread. So these are some of the ones that we featured as we explored in the book, which was released November 1st, I should say, and is available. But these were some of the ones that we explored. Of course, the disruption, the immediate and widespread and dramatic disruption to in-person volunteering. We saw organizations suspending services, or in some cases expanding services. We saw increased recognition of inequities in volunteerism. We also saw an increase in ageism in national discourse. And we saw an ongoing, or maybe I should say, an acceleration of shifting expectations of and by volunteers. So I'd like to unpack each of these 5 types of disruptions, and then we'll pause and have a little discussion, and then we'll talk about some of the strategies. So let's start with this disruption of volunteering itself. According to data from Volunteer Match, one of the nation's largest volunteer matching search engines, by March of 2020, by the end of March of 2020, 93% of all volunteering had just been reported canceled. At the same time, volunteer support organizations were challenged to adapt They needed to balance making the case to continue to engage volunteers to serve now an increased need among many communities, versus while also keeping volunteers safe. So many had to really up their game. And when I talk about volunteer leadership organizations, I mean everything from your local DOVIA, directors of volunteers and agencies, to organizations like Encore Network, to international organizations like IAVE, the International Association for Volunteer Effort, and suddenly had to really up their game in terms of advocacy. Also, leadership organizations shifted, like IAVE, and networks like Encore Network and others needed to promote, or chose to promote, new partnerships, tapping into and supporting informal volunteering and technology in ways that had been unprecedented. Volunteer Match alone looked very heavily upon some of their early research and refocused a lot of their work beyond simply matching volunteers to volunteer opportunities. Their mission was a little bigger than that, but primarily matching volunteers to volunteer opportunities, to instead focusing on building a new online hub that encouraged people to connect to COVID-specific volunteer practices, to enhance technology capabilities to effectively foster COVID-specific and virtual volunteering engagements, and to develop an advocacy platform to offer a trustworthy space for conversations about social justice to occur, to ensure that these inequities, which I'll talk about in a moment, faced by many of our BIPOC communities during COVID, were begun to be dismantled. And they also launched into research as well. Key findings from that research indicated that in the context of the pandemic, of course, the technology was key. Also, national volunteer organizations, leadership organizations were also creating portals and websites and developing online opportunities to network. In other words, everyone was adapting. And yet we also saw, of course, a real need to recruit in different ways. And we're continuing to see that today. We know that because certain organizations had to suspend a lot of volunteerism, think museums, hospitals, hospices, where volunteering was, of course, predominantly in person. Others had to expand services and recruit new groups of volunteers. Think food pantries that suddenly were experiencing a dramatic increase, multifold demand for services, and yet their primary volunteers in many cases were older adults who were deemed most vulnerable and needed to reduce their in-person volunteering. So recruitment pressures shifted, and we keep hearing, and I'd be interested in seeing your experience in the chat as well, that recruitment, whilst different than in 2020 and 2021, as we are rolling quickly into 2023, recruitment is an enormous challenge. And so we need to continue to harness this adaptability, or can we continue to harness this adaptability and recruit in different ways? Of course, research showed that in 2020, 2021, the biggest barrier to volunteering were fear of exposure to the virus and regulations, but we also see an increased recognition of inequitable access to volunteering, that due to different access to digital platforms, due to simply terminology, what we thought might be an open and completely accessible opportunity to volunteer hasn't been as accessible as we think. Of course, we've also had a tremendous focus on virtual volunteering, and yet, as Laura Plato wrote in her chapter, we also have to recognize that as volunteerism was disrupted, our human connection was disrupted, and that as important as virtual volunteering can be, and as it as vital as it can be in keeping connections going. Think of all those volunteer opportunities with, Tech Pals and virtual check-in calls. It's still, and I quote her, "It is through mindful human presence that we bear witness to one another in all our messy, joyous, and inspired humanity, and in the process grow to understand and connect to one another, ourselves, and our world more deeply." So that loss of volunteering, it extends beyond the delivery of services. It affects our ability to connect as humans, and understand each other, celebrate together, mourn together, and that is a ripple effect of the challenges that we've been experiencing in the volunteerism. I've obviously touched on the issue of equitable access to volunteering, as the murder of George Floyd and so many others inspired a renewed focus on racial inequities in this country. We saw an increased focus on equitable access in volunteerism, or more accurately, what became recognized as often inequitable access to volunteerism. And organizations like MAVA, the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Advancement, but not exclusively MAVA, but MAVA is one of those that really increased its effort to listen and provide resources to help organizations better understand how even practices that have long been considered best practices may, in fact, be creating barriers to volunteering. Even the term volunteerism, it can be problematic in that it isn't, while volunteering is universal, the term volunteer is not universal. And so helping organizations understand or connect with their local communities to better understand the language and the perceived barriers to engaging with their organizations, and providing resources to help them do that. And then we have an issue that may be particularly of interest to all of you on this call, and that is the increased ageism. One of the divides that we've seen thwarting social cohesion is between generations, and it's driven by social isolation, instability, and fear, which of course were only increased during the pandemic. In public and private discourse at the beginning of the pandemic, young people were blamed for spreading the virus, while the higher risk of death for older adults was seen as driving many of the shutdowns. And this was as Phyllis Siegel called it, that sticky narrative pitted generations against each other. And it was compounded by the divergent economic effects of COVID-19 among older and younger people. And it really fueled an outbreak of ageism that adversely affected old and young alike. In Phyllis's chapter, she talks about one of the strategies that we'll may have time to talk about throughout the rest of the session, which is co-generational service, not intergenerational service, where we have younger generations serving older adults, or older adults serving, mentoring younger people, but co-generational service, where with people of all ages serving side by side to help address common causes. And this approach to volunteering and to civilian national service is one way to disrupt the age segregation in our civic life. And it helps build bridges across these widening divides and increase our ability to solve all types of problems that our communities face. I'll be interested in hearing, and I'm seeing some of the chat. I've been interested in hearing some of your experience with that as well. Jackie mentions co-generation is wonderful. Robin Ingalls, Robin, great to see you. I see you're talking about recruiting, but I know you all are also looking at co-generational service in really powerful ways. So I hope we have a chance to chat about that as well. I wanted to share before we pause for a moment to look at the chat and give you a chance to weigh in through a poll. I want to talk about one more area of disruption, and that really is, in like so many of the others, not anything that was brand new, but rather an acceleration of an issue that was already in the works frankly, for years. And that was a significant shift in expectations of and by volunteers. For years, volunteers have been seeking more transformational experiences, moving away from transactional time and place-based volunteering to a more comprehensive and transformational approach to engagement. And that's, for organizations to truly embrace that, could be very, very disruptive. What do I mean? I mean that before the pandemic, but especially since the outbreak of COVID and all those other disruptions that I mentioned, people are motivated to volunteer not only by the desire to drive change, but by the desire to be changed personally. And so that really is a challenge to our systems of engagement, which, let's face it, for many organizations were built by and for a greatest generation of volunteers in the 20th century that is no longer relevant. And yet our systems still maintain this expectation that people will show up every Tuesday from 1 to 4, make a year-long commitment, and dutifully report for service and do their work. And yet, as we've been seeing with the retirement of boomers in the early 2000s to and since subsequent generations as well, people are really seeking meaningful impact for their communities and also for themselves. We've also seen some interesting research just in recent weeks regarding age-related motivations. According to research in Voluntas, the International Journal of Voluntary and Nonprofit Organizations, while older adults and retirees volunteer in some ways for ongoing roles, for social and health reasons, and to give back, adults over 65, and interestingly, the same is true for those 18 to 24, are most likely to be the members of the organization where they volunteer for episodic events. So in terms of recruitment, how can we tap into that? Recruiting from our own membership and community, and volunteers up to 24 and 55 to 64 most prefer this event-based volunteering, which again puts that challenge on us. How can we create impact and transformational experiences when people are also seeking one-time opportunities or serial opportunities, as I like to think about them? How can we rethink and repackage volunteer opportunities from ongoing to event-based and tie into some of these motivations? So I'd like to, as we begin to pause and look at some of the comments, I'm launching a poll, so you should see it on your screen, and I invite you to please weigh in. Which of all these disruptions affected your organization or community? And you should be able to provide more than one answer. Was it that volunteer opportunities were limited? Did you have to extend services that required more volunteers? Did you experience an increased recognition of inequities in volunteerism? How did ageism play into your experience and changing expectations from potential volunteers? Love to see those answers as you're weighing in. We'll give you a couple more moments, and I will just do a quick scan of some of the.
While we're waiting for that,
great, Craig, perfect.
Yeah, one of the questions was, is there more current data than the 93% canceled opportunities? And I so that you'd speak to some upcoming data.
Thanks, Craig. I thought you might answer, but I'll give part of it. Feel free to weigh in as well. We do thankfully we've heard that AmeriCorps, our national federal agency dedicated to volunteerism service, does intend to release new Volunteering in America data, we think, in the next month. Don't quote me on that. I'm hearing it third, fourth hand. But we do anticipate new data that usually has state-by-state data as well as national data. And so, yes, we expect that data. We have some other research coming out about as well about funding in volunteer engagement from funders' perspective and entity leader perspective. So we're excited to see what this data shows. Certainly, I think we can all agree anecdotally that we're well beyond that 93%, that organizations have been reopening, re-engaging, and that leads to this challenge around recruitment, I think. But Craig, do you have anything to add about data?
Yeah, I mean, I think those ones are good. I think we have to remember that any data by the time we actually see the study is a little in arrears. And so it's really hard to necessarily really have your finger on the pulse. But in conversations that I've had with state service commissions from one coast to the other, is really a lot of shift in the ability for organizations to attract as many volunteers as they need. And then oftentimes, and one of the things that I think we're all going to see is one of the first people let go during the pandemic was the volunteer coordinator, administrator, manager, because if you're going to cancel 93% of what you're doing, you don't necessarily need that person. And they were either let go or maybe reassigned to other aspects with a new organization. So we've kind of weakened our infrastructure in all ways. And then combined with something that another contributor from MS has shared regularly, that people are reevaluating, and she's often cited that when she calls up someone she used to be able to call up and say, do you have 4 hours? They'll say, I'll send you $100 check, but I don't have 4 hours. So, as part of this whole reevaluation that I think everyone's gone through as a result of the disruptions we faced.
Yeah. And, I think just to build on that a little bit, and let me say, after I make this comment, I'll close the poll, so get your answers in as quickly as you can. But I'll just add that I see some commentary around recruitment and also around ageism here. Robin from Florida talked about recruiting in new ways and framing volunteerism as part of well-being, that basically we have this new vocabulary for people to tap into, acknowledging how harmful it can be not to serve one another, which is, I think, really powerful. And we also see regarding ageism a comment from Grayson, I think it is, from the about the UK and their efforts to remediate a pervasive issue in about ageism in terms of co-working and multi-generational workforce. So thank you, Grayson, for sharing that resource. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and we'll share results. And unsurprisingly, we're all over the board here, right? We're seeing volunteerism opportunities limited identified by 2/3 of you. Another over 1/3 had services extended requiring more volunteers. Inequities in volunteerism by just over 1 in 10 of you. Ageism, nearly 1/3, and over half are experiencing changing expectations from potential volunteers. And of course, we see that in our own experience, in our own work, that people are not just experiencing one disruption, it's multiple disruptions. And so how do we move forward with that in order to, or how do we adapt when we have issues coming from all sides? So what I'd like to do is walk through some of the themes we saw running through many of the stories that we've collected, both in our effort to put this book together and also in subsequent conversations. Some of those themes are redefining relationships and the definition of community. Innovations, including new ways of engaging volunteers and adopting previously resisted practices. Sometimes innovations aren't really new, it's just people are willing to entertain them now that other barriers have been removed. Leadership development, including new ways of looking for leadership and recognizing it. Rethinking investment, what does it take to engage volunteers? And ultimately, it's a disruption itself, but also it's also the answer, shifting from focusing on transactional to more transformational experiences. So let's unpack each of these one by one as well. Community, redefining community. One of my favorite, and I'm very fascinated by this, because within, by the end of 2020, I had clients and colleagues calling and saying, how do we maintain a sense of community in this hybrid workforce where we have some volunteers on hiatus, we have new volunteers coming in, filling in where we used to have volunteers who were veteran volunteers who'd been here for decades, and how do we stay connected? Because part of the motivation for people to volunteer with us has been community. And so many organizations really took, or some organizations took it upon themselves to really think about community. And one organization I like to share, Cornerstone VNA, is one of the many that thought, this is an organization in New Hampshire, that thought very intentionally about who was in their volunteer community. I found that Cornerstone, like other hospices and critical care organizations, were already thinking about community before the pandemic, because many hospice volunteer roles are inherently a solo experience. You don't go and provide hospice volunteer care with a whole cadre of other volunteers. And many volunteers never even interacted in person with others, even prior to the pandemic. And so looking to organizations like Cornerstone to understand how they were already nurturing community across a hybrid workforce has helped other organizations adapt by ensuring that all volunteers, active and inactive, receive the same information, by creating opportunities to welcome new volunteers in and make sure they really understand when they've crossed over that border to be an actual volunteer, not just a newbie, and be welcomed into the community. So having boundaries that aren't about keeping people out, but boundaries that actually let people know when they've actually crossed over into the community is important. Figuring out how you can adapt symbols and rituals that were perhaps just understood or automatic, almost subconscious with our traditional ways of volunteering. How do we adapt those to this virtual world? So redefining community has been important. I look back to our friends at National MS Society, where they were really focused on building connection even when apart. One of the things that Cindy Zaghi-Boilo, the CEO, mandated within days of the outbreak in the US was that we are going to focus on staying connected until we can be together again. And what did that mean? I mean, that's a nice adage, that's a nice motto, but what did it really mean? It meant that staff were supported in shifting how they spent their time. And they were supported and expected to take time to reach out to volunteers, to do surveys, to find out how people were interested in connecting with the organization, even if it was different than the way that they engaged for years before. And then we also see, like I mentioned, an increased focus on dismantling some of the inequities in volunteerism. We saw a huge bump in requests for trainings among organizations like MAVA. And then we see a whole new openness to connecting with informal volunteerism. Prior to 2020, I can't tell you how many organizations I talked to who would say, well, if we connect with this informal service group or this community group, who gets to keep the data? Do we get their emails? By April of 2020, organizations were happy to be connecting with informal networks and saying, we'd love to have volunteers help deliver prescriptions. We'd love to have volunteers making wellness checks, et cetera. Obviously, as long as the safety protocols in terms of if screenings were required, that was handled, but the connection with informal volunteering became much more fluid. Another strategy we saw was, of course, innovation. Our co-editor, Jerome Tennille, talks a lot about, he comes from the corporate engagement world, and he talks a lot about the ways that corporate volunteerism were finally forced to rethink some of the traditional standards of corporate engagement, like service days. In early 2020, he had proposed expanding the idea of MLK Day of Service at his corporation at the time to include learning about issues, not just coming and showing up for 4 hours of service on a day, which can really, frankly, be a burden to the organizations. And it wasn't met with openness in January of 2020. But by January of 2021, suddenly, that resistance to virtual volunteering, to considering learning about issues as an actual part of service, we're much more open. And we see organizations being interested in developing new partnerships and being willing to partner, public-private partnerships, partnerships with informal volunteer networks and community mutual aid societies, and then organizations like Develop for Good out of Stanford. And Craig, can I put you on the spot to describe Develop for Good and their model, or do you want me to give it a shot?
No, sure. I'll try and do that briefly. So some students starting out at their own university, when their internships were canceled at the beginning of the pandemic, said, hey, let's get together and form a couple small teams and help a couple of nonprofits with their technology needs. Other schools and people heard about it, and within 6 months, they got to the place where they would open up a volunteer application window for 1 week and get over 1,000 tech students across the country, and indeed even the world, asking to join these teams. And then they really applied a distributed leadership model to it. So it was literally an unstaffed nonprofit that was able to help dozens and dozens of nonprofits and give students a really important experience that they needed in order to move forward with their careers. And it also focused a lot on women as well as first-gen students. So very successful, but very much from the ground. It wasn't designed from the top, but kind of really was in response to what was happening.
Thanks, Craig. And I'm so inspired by that story. And it's also co-generational, right? With mentors and the students. It's a great example of an innovation. Leadership development also has shifted, and I've touched on this. It's not just about what leadership organizations like an IAVE or Volunteer Match or your local Dovia did, although that was important, but it's also about seeing how volunteer engagement professionals are positioned in the organization. And anecdotally, what we saw was that organizations that already had a history of recognizing volunteer engagement professionals as leaders, whether on a leadership team or just as a leader in the organization, were able to tap into that volunteer resource very quickly. This wasn't featured in the book, but I think about my work with the city of Fort Collins, which is just an hour up the road from me here in Denver, Colorado. And they already had, because of their history, because of their certification as a service enterprise, because of roles that volunteers have played in the city, their citywide volunteer engagement leader, Sue, was already seen as a leader. And Saturday, March 14th, the day after, the day of infamy when so much shut down in the United States, or at least here in Colorado, Sue was on the phone with the emergency manager, who called her to say, how are we going to engage community members in responding to this crisis? And that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago, but because they had positioned volunteer engagement as a citywide strategy, she was able to partner immediately, and within a week or two set up a virtual response center with volunteers from the community playing all sorts of new roles. That's about recognizing leadership in new and powerful ways. And then we also need to think about investment. Organizations including funders. Some still were not seeing volunteer engagement as worthy of investment because of that pervasive and horrible myth that volunteers are free. But others, like UJ Federation of New York, like a few others across the country, said engaging volunteers is vital to COVID response. Engaging volunteers is vital to more equitable, diverse, and inclusive organizations. So how can we invest in equipping organizations to strategically engage volunteers in their response? And Craig also has talked and has a great chapter where he challenges us to think about what it's going to take to really not just move the needle a little, but to invest in and have a 10 times, a 10x payoff in the shift in the way that we engage volunteers and deliver on missions. So hopefully he'll have a chance to chat about that as well. But I just want to move through a last few slides here and concepts so we can really open it up for more discussion. I want to circle back to this last piece around shifting from transactional to transformational. This is about recognizing the multifaceted impacts of volunteering. We've touched on it a little bit as we were talking earlier, that people want to be changed, and serving as volunteers can benefit you health-wise, mental health-wise, physically, and in terms of social connectedness and learning. It obviously also helps the communities being served, the cause, but as we see in national service, it's not just impacts on the community being served and the service member, it's also on the field. How do we equip organizations and future organizational leaders through volunteering to enhance our field in the nonprofit and service and public sectors? We also, there's a great conversation that really took flight amid all these disruptions around the real purpose of volunteering, or one of the, has to do with the impacts, and Angela Parker and Chris Jarvis have a wonderful dialogue around rethinking volunteer experiences in order to ensure that that experience nurtures empathy, so that the people who volunteer really build their empathy, not in any sort of saviorism way, in fact, quite the opposite, empathy for those who are also part of the service or being served. How can we structure? I mean, I think it's about taking a page out of the service learning arena, and I saw some comments earlier about service learning, to really ensure that our volunteer opportunities have some learning, so that that empathy can be nurtured. And finally, all of this has driven us to, again, accelerate, I don't think it's a new conversation, but accelerate how we think about and talk about impact, recognizing that impact isn't just about lunches packed or backpacks distributed or trees planted or animals adopted, or grade level, reading at grade level, though those are all important, but it's also about impacts on the individual, on the community, on the civic engagement as well. What does it take to invest towards this? And also, how do we communicate impact? And it's not just about hours and dollar values. We need to understand first how every volunteer experience is aligned with our purpose, and then pick language that reveals information about that purpose. And so expanding from talking about volunteer value to the worth of engaging volunteers. It's really a more full and accurate term than value, which is just quantity in dollars, usually connotes that, but instead talking about the worth of having individuals make wellness checks, and what did they get from it, and what does that bring to the adults being visited? How does that free staff up to do work for which they're uniquely qualified? There are so many levels of worth and outcome, and we need to be able to continue to move the needle and drive that conversation, because like so many others in the field, I heard so much conversation at the end of 2020 saying, oh, Beth, how do I give my year-end data points, because I'm measured on retention and my retention numbers took a big hit. Well, if that's how volunteer engagement is being measured, is by retention of individuals in the same role year over year, then of course 2020 was a downer, was a challenge. But if we're measuring how we adapt and how we sustain engagement and how we sustain relationships with people, then volunteers and our communities, then we have a much bigger story to tell. And we have to continue to move the needle in that regard. So I certainly hope that you're inspired by some of the stories that I shared. I want to open it up for conversation. I'll just let you know the book is available, and if I've piqued your interest around things like empathy or others, please check it out. I'll share a couple final notes on my part, just a few key takeaways. And some of these are also incorporated into a handout that Kelly will be able to send out along with the slides, that's designed to just help keep your conversation going with others who might not be on the call today. One is to focus on relationship, your relationship with mission, with each other, with your community at large, and think about that intentionally. To welcome innovation from all arenas, not just staff, but partner organizations, community members, informal volunteers, and then see how those innovations work out and determine their sustainability. Think broadly about where you can tap leadership and invest in volunteer engagement. It's not free. It takes an investment of finances, of time, of resources, of space, and of technology to ensure that it is efficient and effective and purpose aligned. And finally, wherever possible, build experiences so that they're transformational, not just transactional, whether that means building empathy or enhancing health. It can mean so many different things. So with that, I want to thank you for the chance to share some of these thoughts. And I'm going to actually stop sharing the slides and turn it over to Craig to see what questions or comments have come up in the chat, and hopefully engage us all in dialogue, because as I said, that's been our purpose. Craig?
Yeah, great. There's been a lot of conversation in the chat, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I would say a couple of lines. One is a lot of people agreeing that what they're seeing is consistent with what you were saying, that a lot of the volunteering hasn't come back, that a lot of people are reevaluating their time. So when they have volunteer opportunities on the weekend, it's like, well, maybe that's not how I want to spend my weekend anymore, whereas it was previously. And Doug certainly mentioned that some people are waiting for the old opportunities to come back versus other people who are looking for the new opportunities. And so there's kind of a blend of things happening there, and something that we have to look at. Other things are like that. A lot of boomers moved to be closer to their children or their grandchildren, and then looked for opportunities in those places. And if the systems are not strong in those particular locations, we're not able to find and connect to opportunities. Another, a lot of question about burnout of both the volunteers, but also the staff and the nonprofits and their ability, because as we talked about, kind of infrastructure has been damaged in this kind of whole process. And then there was a question, and Beth, would be interested to hear your thoughts on, is it time to have colleges consider a volunteering requirement, as many high schools do, to get them in? And that kind of ties to a previous conversation that we had around the National Partnership for Student Success, and how do we find 250,000 additional caring adults to help our students recover from the setback, and really the conditions even before the setback. So be curious your thoughts on that. I mean, I think we know that might be an opportunity, but might also have some big challenges.
Well, great question. What I'd say is that increasingly community service offices are present on most universities. So if I'm seeing the right question.
But the question is
From
kind of,
Grayson
should it be the
around, should it be
requirement?
part of the curriculum? Right.
Yeah.
So, my personal view, I'm not speaking for my editorial team, or my personal view is that there are a lot of challenges and potential problems in requiring volunteer service of high schoolers and younger, and equally of college. I think there is great value in having service, volunteerism and service offices on campus and helping to connect college students to community opportunities. But I personally am not a fan of requirement because I say this with a little trepidation, most organizations, schools that require it haven't actually researched the impact on the community and whether communities have opportunities and capacity to actually engage and accept this workforce that is semester based. It's often a burden on local organizations. So I'm not a huge fan of requiring service. That's being voluntold. That's not volunteering. That said, I think that there is personally great value in creating those opportunities and those connections and greasing the wheels and helping local organizations to equip them to understand how to utilize and engage, I don't like the word utilize, engage with students, high school and college and graduate school as well. And there are some amazing models. The nursing program across the American Red Cross has an amazing connection with nursing students, as do many other organizations. There are great social work students there's a huge hunger for social work students to help with our mental health crisis in lots of organizations, but those are very targeted and supported organizations. Really interesting national service model happening in my own state of Colorado with, I think it's nursing students and mental health students. So I think there are some great opportunities, but I personally think it's problematic to require. I welcome other people to weigh in, and I'll get off my soapbox.
No, that's great. I think we need to do more to encourage, support, make it easier, but probably not require. And as well as make it more recognized, as well. So there's a lot of things I think that we can do that are short of required and probably more effective. There definitely was a lot of question of where I see people would love more data about why this, why that. I think that's something that we all agree. And then also a lot of questions and comments about we really need to drill down and understand so many different aspects of this better. And so I kind of have to bring a comment that I heard from one of our colleagues, Beth, that in many ways, volunteerism is a nervous system without a brain. So it responds. If you poke it with a pin, if you need volunteers for a disaster or you need volunteers for a food pantry or whatever, oftentimes you'll be able to get them. But there really isn't a central organization that's really looking at all of these factors and talking with everyone else and not necessarily just responding to the pinprick, but thinking about, hey, is that really an injury that I need to respond to, or should my resources, my physical resources, go elsewhere? So lots of great comments. Why don't we see if anybody wants to shout something out, because the chat stuff has been great, and hopefully most people will be able to read it.
And while someone might be unmuting, let me also I think Jackie raises a really important point that I'm glad Jackie pointed out in terms of this higher ed. Requiring volunteering of college students may undermine, may just increase inequitable access, because a lot of college students are interested in or need compensated work, and they may not have time to volunteer with no compensation. So I think that's also an issue of equity, which to me again underscores not requiring it, but also looking at paid internships and things like that. Okay, now open to anyone unmuting.
There was another, and another question about Hey, the labor shortage has very much been a factor as well. It's certainly been a massive factor with respect to recruiting for national service positions.
Yep. Yep. Any other comments?
And I think there was one other question about, exactly, does the book cut things this way and that way? And I would just say that the book's intent is food for thought around lots of subjects and lots of ways. It isn't trying to distill it and interpret it and tell you, this is probably what you should do based on what we heard. It's 20 some examples of either people's thought leadership or their actual actions that they took and how that worked and what stimulated it. So just wanted to provide that clarity.
And most have tips at the end that you can then take as well. And we're working on a book group discussion facilitation guide that could help you have those discussions and shift to actionable items. But right, it's not a playbook.
Yeah. And again, so Joanne, would love you to speak, I think, to the labor shortage a little bit more, as well as there was an earlier comment about nonprofits who are saying, hey, it's easier for me, it'd be better for me to just hire people than deal with volunteers anymore.
Those who are saying it's better for us to hire people than engage volunteers, I think it's tempting to say, well, we don't want to sacrifice a volunteer culture, and that organizations that continue to engage volunteers we see as being more adaptable, sustainable, and capable of going to scale. That said, there are roles that may have been easy to fill in 1972 or 2001 that are not viable positions anymore. And so I do encourage some organizations to think about where should you invest in having paid staff, and what roles, without breaking labor laws and laying people off and replacing them with volunteers. I'm not an attorney, but I'm not recommending that. But where can we engage people for their skills on projects in ways that could also help us steward our financial resources better? So in terms of that, I think, I think it's important to balance out who's being hired and who's not. In terms of labor shortage, it also is, we have a crisis, a hiring crisis, and again, we don't want to break labor laws, but there are also vital roles that volunteers can be playing to create some continuity and help build our capacity as organizations. So I think it's about balancing it and being thoughtful. And Joanne, if work is essential, should it not be paid? There are plenty of organizations that are all volunteer that don't have a paid employee, and vital work is done by volunteers. So, so that's, to me, that's not a one-to-one correlation.
And Doug's reminded me that we need to wrap up, and I just want to say one last kind of comment. I guess, as you look at this final poll of, did you learn something today? Is a little bit, you can look at this from the perspective of the nonprofit, and that is, how do I get the most done in the most efficient way? But we also need to look at it from the community and the volunteers' perspective. And we are stronger as a community when people engage in helping us solve problems. And then they make other choices in their life, like how they vote, how they live, based on getting close enough to care. And one of the things that nonprofits provide is that ability to get people close enough to care about issues that they might not otherwise see, other than through data. So Beth, would you like to give us a final 1 minute thought?
I'll give you a 30-second thought. I think that we each, regardless of our role or title in the organization, volunteer, CEO, board member, volunteer engagement professional, whatever it is, we each have an opportunity, and I would say an obligation, to be advocates for engaging volunteers and in documenting how volunteers have helped us transform these disruptions into impact, and being ready to leverage that in the future, because other disruptions will come, hopefully not as dramatic, but they're inevitable. And so this is an important opportunity to exercise our adaptability muscles, but we need to think about it, reflect on it, and then talk about it and advocate for it. So thank you all for the work that you do and the advocacy that you do. Craig?
Yes, thank you all for the work that you do, and thank you for being here today. It was a great crowd with great interactions. Let's make this the beginning of the conversation, not the end. So please just send your comments to any and all of us, and let's keep going. Doug, do you have any final closing remark?
Only that thank you to both Craig and to Beth, but only to mention quickly that we will not have a webinar in December. We're going to take the month off and enjoy the holidays, but we'll be back in January. More on that to come. And if you'd like to learn more about the Encore Network, if you're not currently a member or you don't know about us, go to encorenetwork.org. You can learn a lot of information. You can sign up and get information about all of our future events. So thanks for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.